Welcome back to the History of Modern Japan. I'm Adam Cathcart at the University of Leeds. What follows is lecture number 9 in our series on Japan in the 20th century. This focuses on the Tokyo trials and connects to a short assessment where students analyze and discuss a piece of primary documentation or a piece of scholarship about the Tokyo trials. The lecture will proceed in 3 basic chunks. First being historiography, second evidence and procedures, third crimes and defendants, and may lead into a few tangents here and there, but I'll try to keep it relatively concise. The Tokyo trials lasted from the spring of 1946 until November 1948. So it is a tremendously long period of time, almost 2.5 years of prosecution. It's an incredibly protracted process, which is much longer than its counterpart on the German side, the Nuremberg trials. Like Nuremberg, it does result in hangings of a number of defendants, and I'll get into the defendants and the crimes with which they were charged. For which they were charged shortly. But in the end, you had 7 executions of Japanese war criminals and 26 sentences. So it's an awfully huge procedure for actually a relatively small number of defendants, and it becomes a kind of a piece of Tokyo's everyday life, and it comes and goes, interest, and ultimately it did not spark. So now moving into historiography, while it was a big deal in 1946, interest waned in 1947 and 1948. The Cold War really began to emerge with civil war in China, the growth of the Chinese Communist Party, the United States realizing it needed to change course in Japan and treat Japan more like an ally and a potential alliance partner in Japan after the occupation, to hedge against China and the Soviet Union, and so sentences were lightened up. But there was not a big outcry really over the verdicts when they finally came down, and when these war criminals were killed in 1948. And the writing about the trial is actually quite sparse. In the first sort of generation, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was very little interest. Now, part of that is because the transcripts were never published. They were slowly made available in various archives. There was no sort of central repository. After the US occupation ended in 1952, the Japanese government showed very little interest in kind of going back to this because it was so embarrassing for so many people still in government at that time in the 1950s. Indeed, some of the individuals charged came back into government as the foreign minister, with the Kishi Nobusuke cabinet and the kind of the growth of the Liberal Democratic Party that still rules Japan today. So you still have governs, I should say. So you had a number of reasons on the Japanese side why there would be no desire to return. The emperor and the royal family obviously had no desire to go back and look at this. And in the United States, the Cold War was on. There's no point in really going back and revisiting and digging up various Japanese war crimes, when the target of the crimes, China, was now your main enemy, one of your main enemies in the Cold War, territorially speaking anyway. And it just simply, there wasn't much interest. This changed a bit in 1972 with the publication of the book Victor's Justice. And it kind of a Vietnam-era change came about, basically saying, the trial was marred by not just incompetence, but probably a type of sort of American imperialism and arrogance, which was on full display in the Vietnam War, and that the discussions of war crimes against the Japanese people, for example, the bombing of civilians, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the atomic bombs, which had come up very, very, very briefly and was quickly shut down during the Tokyo war crimes trials, needed to be foregrounded more. So there's a revisiting then in the 1980s of some of the dissent around Justice Pal, the justice from India, who had written a 1,200-page dissent for the court in 1948 and put forward some arguments that the trial was really, really flawed on those grounds. And so it's a kind of the moral equivalence or moral hypocrisy argument, largely. In the 1990s, we got the growth of a real explosion of growth of interest in the Tokyo trials, indeed in the U.S. occupation of Japan. And the apogee of this, really, we can see in a couple of books, which I have sitting right here. Embracing Defeat, John Dower's Pulitzer Prize-winning treatment of the U.S. occupation of Japan, always worth reading and rereading. He's got a huge chapter in here on the trials. And Herbert Bix's big Hirohito biography, Hirohito, of course, being the emperor from 1926 to 1989. He was the wartime emperor. And Bix and Dower, of course, both writing and working in the city of Boston, have very different views of Japan, but the trials form an important part of those two critical books. You had the publication of these transcripts, the Tokyo Major War Trials trial, by I think it's John Pritchard, who's to say it in a kind of complimentary way, he's a bit OCD. He's a bit obsessive, and he pulled it all together. So this was published by Mellon Press, which is a press that a lot of people have bad things to say about in terms of their quality control, but it's a very essential transcripts all put in one place finally and available in research libraries. And this runs, I think, 126 volumes, something like that. They've got volume 26 here, 40,000 pages, something like that. So just the primary source material is finally put together in one place. The U.S. National Archives began to publish finally declassified materials on which was a combination Japanese and German war crimes materials that the United States had basically classified and kept under wraps, some sort of embarrassing stuff to the United States about things they had left out, including biological weapons research left out of the trials. And so there's interest there. This was during the Clinton administration, the administration of Bill Clinton. He put together a task force on that, kind of on U.S. Documents around Japanese and German war crimes prosecutions. So you have impetus there, and a number of scholars are really trained up in this period thinking about international law. Now, what is going on in the 1990s that would lead us to be thinking about looking back at international war crimes prosecutions from a legal standpoint, from a standpoint of case law, from a standpoint of how do we define war crimes, war responsibility, what are crimes of aggression, what is genocide? Of course, you had a number of horrific wars in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, namely the breakup of Yugoslavia. So you had a large number of Europeans looking on in horror at the falling apart of the Yugoslavian state and the fragmentation into ethnocide and genocidal acts in the Balkans, which went through the 1990s, all the way through the U.S. intervention in Kosovo in 1999. And you also had the Rwandan genocide in 1994, which stimulated a large number of largely French-speaking scholars, but globally, to get interested in sort of how do we put together a tribunal on this? What role should the UN or international law play in prosecuting war crimes, the Hutu and the Tutsis, in the case of Rwanda, a former French colony? So things were happening in the 1990s. It was in the air, so to speak, to return to this. And you also had a massive turn in a growth in studies of the U.S. occupation of Japan. Some of that coming out of the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing in August 1995 being a main anniversary, a big Smithsonian exhibition in Washington, D.C. that created huge sparks. And scholars like David Fedman, who are probably about 40 years old now, working their PhDs, and they're doing their graduate work in the late 1990s and early 2000s, including myself being part of that cohort, generationally speaking, were really, really hit with this kind of war memory and a need to go back and look at the U.S. occupation of Japan. So those are things we covered in our last lecture. Okay, so evidence, so finishing with historiography, just quickly, the last thing that happened is the rise of China and the rise of Chinese funding for research and China's own anti-Japanese sentiment, which we'll deal with in lecture number 11. So you have a massive, the interest in the Tokyo trials because you had a Chinese judge participating, the role of war crimes prosecutions of the Japanese in China by the Chinese state, and these are covered in some conferences in the West. Here's one being sort of Singapore, and intellectually speaking, I shouldn't call it the West really, but Dublin had some big conferences, and Cambridge, my colleague Barak Kushner, who published a great book, Men to Devils, Devils to Men, which won a big prize, I think in 2008, 2009, something like that, around Japanese crimes as seen in China and Chinese research. And there's been an explosion of that in China since the late 1990s. Primarily, when it had been sort of suppressed, actually. So all these archives are kind of opening up, people being encouraged. I published a number of pieces in the 2010s and the late 2000s dealing with the aughts, I should say, dealing with new Chinese materials that have come out, and those are still coming out. And China's putting massive emphasis on this in their journals, in their education system. And again, we'll kind of come back to that in week number 11. But that, again, adds kind of an impetus. And we're still putting all this together. In fact, that's why it's important to be reading in other languages. But so that gives you kind of a sense of the scope of the historiography. Hopefully, it's interesting because there's not really like revisionism, so to speak. There isn't really a standard, unlike something like the Korean War or World War II or the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima. The first generation of scholarship isn't really there. There's nobody out there writing a massive book in the 1962 about the Tokyo trials, basically saying, look at it, it's a great example of U.S. internationalism and the U.S.-based, rules-based world order in the 60s. It wasn't happening because the United States didn't really want to go back and look at World War II in Japan, and specifically kind of some of the problems of the post-war, including the trials at that time. Okay, so historiography, here we are, we finished that. Evidence and procedures. It's a little bit boring, but also quite important to think about the role of evidence. And as the students in this particular module know, it's a good time to be thinking about what kind of documents do we have, why do arguments reflect the documents that they're based in, how do historians mishandle evidence, how do we deal with absences, what happens when we don't have the data we need, and how is it that myth can kind of creep in the absence of evidence. And then in the case of certain myths and tropes in the Japanese right wing in particular, this notion of American hypocrisy, the Justice Paul argument, the fact that there is this dissertation, basically 1,200 pages of writing, basically by one justice, which was not made very public at the time in the West anyway. I think he published it in India. But why does this have such resonance with the Japanese right wing today, where they basically say, we got a bad deal, this is Victor's justice, this is discrimination. The Tokyo trials were a complete farce. And we really ought to be focusing on the U.S. atrocities from the air, as well as the Soviet atrocities when they took over Manchuria, this northeast China, when they smashed Manchukuo in 1945. The Japanese empire was not a bad thing, and we need to rehabilitate it. So let's find little bits and pieces outside of Justice Paul's narrative. Let's find testimonies from the defense in the Tokyo war crimes trials that are basically saying Japan was doing great stuff. They were anti-communist. They were fighting against the bandits. There was no coherent Chinese state at the time. Japan, were the only force for order in the region. And we shouldn't be charged for war crimes. So the evidence is really, really important because these little fragments that exist, or in the case of Justice Paul's dissent, the big fragments, are picked up and brought into the present. And they're fought over every single day in a tactical way, online, in blogs, in journal articles, because the Chinese state has got one point of view, the Japanese state has its own point of view as well, and is quite concerned that they don't want to be painted as eternal war criminals and to kind of undermine the foundations of the Tokyo trials by pointing to the lack of evidence in certain ways, or the structure of the arguments is very, very powerful. Okay, so Dower, in his long chapter on the Tokyo trials, talks about the problems of setup with the Tokyo trial, and there are a number of critiques, and we could critique it almost endlessly for the issues which it sort of plowed through. One being the lack of certain types of evidence and the decisions not to seek out other kinds. So, for example, one of the main, two of the main points made in the prosecution were about the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo, and that establishing that basically this was under the command of the Japanese Kwantung Army, that it engaged in certain structural crimes, but primarily that it was a crime of aggression against the Republic of China. And secondly, the rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre, as a symbol of wider Japanese atrocities in 1937-38, in particular on the Chinese mainland and in this kind of urban core of the Republic of China. And so what kind of evidence did they have? What did they collect? They brought over, I believe, 3 Chinese witnesses. And so, in fact, largely what you have to discuss the Nanking atrocities, you've got 3 Chinese witnesses in this massive trial. You're spending weeks and weeks on the Nanking Massacre, but your main witnesses, your star witnesses, are white people, doctors from the state of Ohio, like Merle Bates, who were missionaries teaching at Nanking University's history department, medical missionaries as well. So you get these kind of white Christians who are there voicing their perception of Japanese atrocities. And sometimes they've got evidence, like film. There was a very important canister of film which showed women as victims of sexual violence in clinics, basically, who had been attacked with Japanese bayonets after they'd been assaulted. So these are real kind of records, and it is valuable testimony. But you don't have kind of the voice. You don't have a Chinese sexual assault victim, for example, being interviewed. And of course, there's all kinds of ethics around that. But Nicola Henry is a scholar who kind of looks at that, kind of the role of sexual assault and crimes of that nature in the as war crimes, and their absence from Tokyo. There's a new article which I happen to review for the journal China Quarterly, which has just come out. It's called "What is Criminal and What is Not? Prosecuting Wartime Japanese Sex Crimes in the People's Republic of China." So there's a large amount of a kind of a gray area and of issues that are not really discussed in detail at the time, and this creates a problem because there's a huge amount of interest in this today, and the issue of Japanese sex crimes in particular has absolutely exploded since the 1990s. And I've got a picture here of Madame Kim Bok-dong, who was, with a picture of herself in an earlier time, a Korean comfort woman, and they're still engaged, of course, in suing the Japanese government, trying to get redress, apologies, and that's again a topic we'll deal with in a subsequent lecture. So that was left off. Japanese biological weapons research left out of the picture. I've got a brilliant novel here. I don't normally recommend novels. Well, I guess I do. Every other week or so there's a novel that gets recommended. David Pease is a Yorkshireman who lives in Japan, writes about Ryosuke Akutagawa, Akutagawa Ryonosuke, who, of course, published his book, which we read, I think, in week 2, or a short story we read about the ball and Butokai and kind of westernization. He's a Taisho era writer. And of course, we talked also about John Paris, the pseudonym for the Sir Gwatkin, the foreign office official in Tokyo who's writing, fictional treatments of Japanese women, almost parodies in the 1920s. Well, David Pease is probably the closest we have to a kind of a document Hoover. He is very interested in this book about writing about plague in Tokyo and biological weapons. So it's a fictional treatment by a British writer who lives in Tokyo of the chase, the hunt for Unit 731, and how and why this was all covered up by the United States occupation, why it wasn't covered in the Tokyo trials. It's very evocative. It's fun. That book's about £5 online, something like that. But if you want to know more about that, there's a book called Factories of Death by Sheldon Harris, which describes basically Unit 731, which has been discussed many times in our module, a water purification unit up here in the north of Manchuria, Harbin. And essentially that this unit engaged in human experiments, killed directly probably about 5,000 people through experiments, and then resulted in recurring plagues. You know, there was a Black Plague outbreak in 1946 after they left, and Northeast China still finds, you know, chemical weapons under the soil and things of that nature. And essentially his research was absorbed into the U.S. occupation of Japan, and they made a deal with him for his silence and for keeping him off and out of the docket. In spite of the fact that he was quite well publicized in China, especially when China went communist in 1949 and 1950. You know, he becomes quite a well-known, indeed an infamous character in the Soviet bloc and in Asia in particular, but is more or less repressed in U.S. reports, and none of the chemical weapons and biological weapons was skated over and more or less left out of the Tokyo trials. So the last piece of evidence and procedures, which I'll mention, is the role of the royal family in Hirohito. So the, and of course Bix is our great source for Hirohito in English. It's an authoritative biography that I think also won a massive prize around the year 2000. Also quite cheap. Cheap and plentiful, very important, so highly recommended. But essentially Hirohito was left off. He was never formally investigated or interrogated, and of course he's nominally the head of everything in Japan. And his private papers, lots of things were kind of moved around, not made available, and of course at the end of the day, the last piece, since I'll come back to Hirohito shortly, is the destruction of records in this 2-week interregnum between the surrender by Hirohito in August 1945 and the arrival of American troops at Tsuki Air Force Base airfield, I should say, in August 30th, 1945. That's when MacArthur arrives, and the surrender ceremony with the USS Missouri, these evocative guns over the back, sort of overshadowing the limping Japanese foreign minister Shigemitsu in his evocative top hat, as well as his Harvard-educated aide from the Foreign Office, or the Gai Musho Foreign Ministry of Japan, as well as a number of Allied representatives. That happens on September 3rd, 1945. So you got 2 weeks and a few days, and there were bonfires all over the place, right? And I think this has been covered previously in the module, so I won't dwell on it, but Dower, it talks about the smoke over the city, and it's not from the bombing of the U.S. Around August 20th, 25th. You know, there's loads of documents which just go into the bin and into the fires. And auto de fe, as some evocative writers might mention, like Nabokov and his wonderful Ben Sinister, highly recommended. Sorry, not Ben Sinister, Pale Fire, rather. Which I mentioned also in terms of, in the module, in terms of its discussion of evidence and who controls the narrative and who has the primary evidence. So there you have it. Okay, crimes and defendants. I have to be very, very swift now because I'm over the 20-minute mark, and studies have shown that you may have tuned me out. Crimes and defendants. Okay. Hirohito's off the list. Most of his family members are off the list. The United States chose not to have him abdicate or to force him to abdicate. The Constitution was rewritten so that his godlike status or god status is kind of removed. But he's kept in place as an important symbol for MacArthur and for the U.S. occupation. Still a controversial decision down to this day. But he's left off. So who is charged and with what? And I think this is quite important because when we look at the war crimes trials that happen around the empire, the former Japanese empire at the end, places like Singapore, Hong Kong, right? British military is running these trials. The Philippines, the U.S. Army is running those trials. The former Dutch East Indies or the Indonesia, you've got the Dutch running a massive number of small trials there. Guam, you had American military trials there of Japanese defendants. etc., etc. And then indeed, in Japan, you had smaller trials in Yokohama, the port, industrial port very close to Tokyo. So and in smaller places as well. So we call those Class B and Class C war crimes trials because they're military trials and they're run for specific acts of murder and torture and crimes. So this is sort of face-to-face killing. These are local officials. It might be a prison camp commander who went out and murdered a specific American prisoner of war. And so it's very, very specific. And they do gather local evidence. But they are not the architects of the war. They are not massive policy makers. You had General Yamashita in the Philippines, who was charged quite early, and he's sort of the highest level of that type of trial. But generally speaking, you're talking about officers and below who are being charged with crimes at the Class B and Class C, and that's been an area of real interest and growth in the last 10, 15 years. So this discussion is one at Tokyo where you're talking about architects. You're talking about a small number of defendants. I think I mentioned something like 27, 28. Ultimately, 7 death sentences. They had 8, but I think 1 died prior to them being carried out. So you had effectively you had to define war crimes, and you had to define what was Japan being charged with here actually, and who is going to be in the dock. So I will make it very, very swift. Essentially, what you had were a somewhat random collection of people at the top. You had Hirota, who was a prime minister of Japan in a period when it was angling toward war with the United States, but not actually at war with the United States. They were not formally at war with China, but they were in China at war. And so Hirota is one of the key defendants. You would have had other prime minister level defenders, except they killed themselves, right? So here I'm talking about Prince Konoe, Konoe Fumimaru, who's a fascinating figure who I've mentioned previously in the module, with kind of a European orientation, elite artistic family, kind of connected to the royal family. But he tried to help sort of set things up into October 1945. He was around trying to make peace, supposedly, at the end of the war, get kind of a surrender settlement for Japan, but he ended up killing pigs and poison and taking himself offline. So you had other people who straddled the line between military and civilian. Hideki Tojo Hideki, who is the Minister of War and Prime Minister throughout the 1940s. He's the Prime Minister when war is declared on the United States and the Pearl Harbor attacks occur. But this guy's got a huge, long CV dating back to the Kwantung Army, dating back to Manchuria, Japanese military intelligence. So, he's an obvious candidate for kind of being at the top of the list, and Tojo was sort of the star witness. And with the absence of the emperor, Tojo kind of took up this image of kind of that he was in charge, and they tried to shield the emperor throughout the procedures. And then you had just normal generals. So you have kind of civil, including people in the foreign ministry, who are being charged with Class A war crimes. That they created the structures, they conspired to attack China and to attack the United States and to attack the British Empire and Dutch holdings and French holdings as well. And so it's conspiracy counts. And so it's quite a random group of individuals who are brought together. They live together in Sugamo prison, and they're driven in a little bus over to the proceedings on most days. And they talk to each other all the time. And there are large numbers of people and defendants in Sugamo, including Kishinobusuke, the future prime minister, who are keeping diaries, smuggling things out, essays being published pseudonymously. They know newspapers are available. They know how they're being received in the media. Tojo is giving speeches occasionally about Japan's great anti-communist Pan-Asianism. And he's kind of stopped in the middle of a speech and just, is this for the newspapers or is this for the record, General Tojo? And so it's a very interesting kind of dynamic, fluid discussion there. And Sugamo Prison has been an area of great interest for scholars ever since, because you have diaries coming out of there, again, the people who are not charged but are still there and ultimately released by General MacArthur, usually right around Christmas 1948, soon after they escaped the noose and escaped for the prosecution. So those individuals, and I've done a study of this, soon after the lockdown here in Great Britain began, I made sure I had a copy of the Hirohito book by Bix, and I decided to kind of go through and look at all the people around the decision to go to war with the United States and Great Britain in December 1941, leading up to that. And of course, Hirota is one of the key characters, but there are so many others. And there are some really, really important people, including prime ministers. The government's changed many, many times. And foreign ministers that change many, many, many times. Generals themselves who rotate around. People are stationed in Korea, and they go down. After the war starts, they go down to Malaya. Then they're back up in the Philippines. They have opportunities to create crime, to do war crimes in the field at many, many points, including in Manchukuo, right? Who's in charge of Unit 731, for example? What are the bureaucratic lines of control there? Does the Emperor know about Unit 731? And so this tangled web of these very, very large, what you do realize at the end of the day, and this will be my concluding thought, is that the decision to take on these 20 plus defendants is largely a decision of convenience. Who is alive? Who is available? What kind of evidence do we have that might suggest that they were involved in a conspiracy? The fact that you have a conspiracy case means individuals within the conspiracy might not know about one another. I encourage you all to read The Godfather by Mario Puzo, which is available in 8 long hours or 14 hours on YouTube. You can listen to it. And it's very, very useful for thinking about conspiracy and layers of accountability, and how does a mafia organization protect the top leadership, insulate them from legal jeopardy. And the fact is that the American law that was used against the Japanese government in the Tokyo trials, this military tribunal, was based on American corporate law, this kind of gangster going after gangs, right? It's business law. Basically, what is a conspiracy? How do we go after a criminal family in the city of Chicago in the era of Prohibition? And so ultimately, the conspiracy is the main glue hanging the prosecution together on the part of the Americans. And the conspiracy is that Japan conspired starting in 1928, not 1894, 1895, not 1919, not the 21 demands against the Chinese, not 1931, when the Manchurian incident happened, not 1937, when Japan invaded China, not 1941, when Pearl Harbor was hit, and Hong Kong and the various Singapore, other British holdings. It's 1928. And so it's quite an arbitrary decision. And all these people don't have to even know one another. They don't know what is coming, if you kind of trace it all back. But the sourcing, and what that means is that all the sources can get thrown in the pot at the Tokyo trials. The discussion can be literally all over the place, and it is. The evidence can be all over the place. I know I said I was concluding, but I'll give you one anecdote from the U.S. Archives, where I was there studying the Tokyo war crimes trials, and I'm looking for evidence about the rape of Nanking, and you order these boxes, and they come out on these big wheels. And I ordered some evidence from the Tokyo trials, right? And I got this one box. I thought, this is the heaviest box of evidence I've ever seen in my life. And nearly harmed myself taking it off the crate, off of the rolling shelf, and putting it on my desk, which is of course under many cameras, and open it up, and it is basically, they've got iron bars for printing money, the printing press, basically, they out of the Philippines to print puppet money from the Philippines. And somebody thought this was a great idea. We don't need a piece of paper of Japanese money from its occupation of the Philippines in 1942. We need like the steel bronze bars that slap down and print the money. So the actual heavy thing is shipped over to Tokyo to prove what? That the Japanese ran an economy during the occupation of the Philippines, and that they tried to govern the areas that they attacked and occupied. And so it just literally everything gets thrown in. There's so much randomness, and these files are really poorly organized in Washington, D.C., and the trial was poorly organized. So you get, you read these transcripts, and they go on long tangents about translations, or why are I need to read this into the record, why it was already published. Or you're hitting the defendants play a long role as well in kind of protracting and slowing the process down. So the defendant will be said, you published an essay in 1940 praising the doctrine of Pan-Asianism in Japan's invasion of China. So, this connects to conspiracy, right? And what's the answer? The answer is, we need to stop the trial right now. I have no recollection of writing that, right? Ambassador Oshima, you were given a medal by Hitler, right? I have no recollection of that. I mean, it's possible that Hitler put a medal on me in 1940. We better take a break from the proceedings so that I can consult with my lawyers, because I couldn't possibly answer that right now under oath. And so the defendants are very clever. Sometimes they're speaking in local dialects, like an Osaka dialect, to slow down the interpreters. You got judges from 11 or 13 different countries, simultaneous translation, journalists, the whole thing. It turns into a bit of a circus. And the defendants know it. And this is another reason that the trial is sort of forgotten. But it also makes it fun for us, because here we are, 70, 80 years later. And we're able to actually still have some value by going back and reading the transcript, seeing what was going on, getting into some of those archival nooks and crannies, and answering some of those questions like, why was Hirohito not prosecuted? What do we know? Is there new evidence coming out? Unit 731. David Peace certainly has a new take, which is quasi-fictional, on Ishishiro in Unit 731. And of course, much more to the point of historiography, the questions about sex crimes and the Japanese invasion of China in particular continue to drive interest in this subject. So I hope it's one that you continue to study and follow the historiography on. Thank you very much.